Hey guys, welcome. Today we will have Professor Yunus Ballim, who is Emeritus Professor from the University of the Witwatersrand. He's going to talk about student development as academic freedom, exploring the intersections of teaching and learning with institutional culture. Professor Ballam holds BSc, MSc, and PhD degrees in civil engineering from the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg. He spent 6 years in the construction industry, and after that, he's been a full-time academic since 1989. His research is mainly in cement and concrete materials. He was the founding president of the African MRS. He served as deputy vice chancellor academic at WITS for 7 years, and he was also the founding vice chancellor of the Saul Platier University in Kimberley. He has served on the Council of Higher Education and was chair of the Higher Education Quality Council, apart from many, many, many other recognitions. So thank you very much, Professor Balam, for taking the time. I think this is going to be a very different seminar from the stuff that we usually have. So I thank you again, and the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much, Professor Surani, firstly for inviting me, and also greetings. I guess it's morning on your end, so good morning to all the students who've participating in this seminar, and of course the academic staff. And that reminds me that in this lecture I will use the word academic to mean people who teach, what you would refer to as faculty. For us, faculty is an administrative unit. So I will refer to academics and academic staff as the people who teach in this lecture. I must say I did offer Professor Suranani the opportunity to give a lecture on heat flow in concrete, which is my current research area. But he thought that a lecture on academic freedom would be more interesting. I promised to speak for about 35, 40 minutes, and that should leave us with enough time to have a few comments and some discussion. So what I intend to do in this lecture is to broaden the understanding of concepts of academic freedom, and I will explain why I think a broadening is necessary. And I want to focus as my central concern the argument that is really has two parts. Firstly, I'm concerned with the obligations that the principles of academic freedom place on a university in regard to the ways in which it will approach the educational development of its students. In other words, what does academic freedom mean to students? We know what it means to universities, but what does it mean to students? And then secondly, I'm concerned with what students can expect in their learning experience at a university that claims to be guided by the principles of academic freedom. Together with the important role of the formal curriculum, I will give some consideration to the nature and character of the institutional culture of the university and the ways in which it influences the learning experience and impacts on the identity of students. That's an important issue that I want to deal with. And the sense that universities and university education impacts on the identity of students as well. The earlier focus in South African universities on the institutional autonomy aspect of academic freedom was largely a response to the aggressive antagonism of the apartheid state towards free and critical thinking in the world of ideas, which after all is the principal benefit of a university in society. However, in the post-apartheid university, local and global developments on matters such as the need to respond to the hurt caused by institutional forms of social exclusion, the fragile nature of our environment, deepening human misery in the world, and the provision of healthcare in our unequal economic systems have all added many layers of complexity to our thinking around academic freedom and the choices that universities are to make in responding to their purpose. Universities broadly acknowledge that consideration of these and similar critical concerns of the human condition should feature strongly in the development of the intellectual bent of their students, or what is often referred to as the graduateness of a student. I'll use that word a few times, as they progress towards leaving the university to become the organic intellectuals of society. The ways in which universities teach and direct student learning is therefore an important expression of the institution's responsibility to its public. So, and I'm going to contextualize this in the South African higher education sector to start with, only because I know that best, but also I will expand to more global positions. Yeah. So the South African higher education system traces its focus on academic freedom to the years leading up to the promulgation of what was known as the Extension of Universities Act, passed by the Nationalist Party in 1959, which established separate universities for different racial groups in South Africa. In a demonstration of what a good university leadership is meant to be, Professor Thomas B. Davey, then the Vice-Chancellor at the University of Cape Town, chose to speak out against the idea of enforced racially segregated universities, when many of his academic and administrative colleagues in South African universities were either silent or actively supportive of state policy at the time. In what has come to be known as the T.B. Davey formulation of academic freedom, he called for universities to retain the right to decide who shall be taught, who shall teach, what shall be taught, and how it will be taught. These are the so-called four academic freedoms, and it's often referred to as the T.B. Davey formulation. In this sense, Professor Davey loudly pronounced that there's a corner in society called the university, where the shadow of unreason cannot be allowed to fall. The years that followed saw a much more muscular implementation of state policy in South Africa for racial segregation and structural inequality, with sustained and often violent attacks on dissenting universities, their academic staff, and their students. And indeed, a number of academics were killed by security police. In this milieu, expressions of academic freedom featured so strongly in anti-apartheid discourse that South Africans now live in a country where the principle of academic freedom is captured in the preamble to the country's constitution. The T.B. Davey formulation has also had a profound influence on the United States Supreme Court decisions on university academic freedom and affirmative action matters. And for those students who are interested in the influence of South African thinking on this matter in the US, you should look at a very good online essay by David Oppenheimer in 2022 in the California Law Review. I'm not going to talk any more about that. However, it is not difficult to recognize that the T.B. Davey formulation of academic freedom is essentially a call for institutional autonomy. This was appropriate for its time and context, but it is not a full capture of the rights and responsibilities that are associated with academic freedom. An exclusive focus on institutional autonomy misses the point that the university itself can act in ways that are at odds with the principles of academic freedom. So, for example, excluding particular groups of students who are considered as the other, or directing academics away from research or teaching subjects that are considered unacceptable by the political authorities, would be in keeping with institutional autonomy, but not in keeping with the principles of academic freedom. So in other words, it is possible for an institution internally to compromise the principles of academic freedom. I therefore wish to focus my argument on the obligations that the principles of academic freedom place on a university in the ways in which it is to approach the educational development of its students, and for their part, the reasonable expectations that students may hold about the educational experience that they will find when they choose to learn at a university that acknowledges academic freedom principles as a part of its core values. Even as universities respond to the public concerns of the time, it is essential that they keep sight of their primary purpose, which is to educate their students in ways of reasoning and understanding, through critical engagement with new ideas and with received wisdom, based on the values that the institution has chosen to serve. In dark times, such as South Africa saw in the apartheid years, or what Europe and Asia saw in the era of fascism, totalitarianism in the mid-20th century, university intellectuals serve best by rising above the pollution, breathing clearer air, and thinking and speaking honestly to their publics. As an example of an era of different concerns, in a 1967 address to the US Congress, in which he expresses concerns about student protests at many US universities during the Vietnam War years, Senator Fulbright saw this as a conflict of values in what students expect to find at a university and what they actually find at the university. He argued that students, and here I'm quoting, having seen their country's leaders caught in inconsistencies which are politely referred to as a credibility gap, they now see their universities, the last citadels of moral and intellectual integrity, lending themselves to ulterior and expedient ends, and betraying their own fundamental purpose, which in James Bryce's words, is to reflect the spirit of the time without yielding to it. Senator Fulbright goes on to express concern about the effects of on US universities of government consultancies related to the war in Vietnam. He notes, and I'm quoting again, no less than businessmen, workers, and politicians, professors like money and influence. Having traditionally been deprived of both, they have welcomed the contracts and consultantships offered by the military establishment. Most of these funds go to large institutions, but they do, on the whole, make a contribution to higher learning. A contribution, however, which is purchased at a very high price. That price is the surrender of independence, the neglect of teaching, and the distortion of scholarship. As social institutions, universities must always act to sustain the confidence of their publics, those to whom they speak, and those on whose behalf they speak as academics and intellectuals, in the value of what universities do, so that what universities do is worthy of their support and defense. Let me just alert you, sorry, I'm using the word values, and I didn't tell you what I meant. I'm using the word values to mean the things that direct behavior in the absence of rules. So, for example, what is it that will make you help an old person carry their groceries across the road? It's your values. There are no rules that says you must. However, my definition is open to what we would normally call negative values as well. So selfishness, by my definition, would be a value because it directs behavior in particular ways. And so I'm clearly making the point that values are contestable and that universities have to think about these things. It is correct to expect that student learning will be influenced by the ways in which values are expressed at the place of learning, and that this will influence the extent to which learning experience at the university have shaped or developed students in their social and ethical approaches, which, together with the ability to successfully complete their course assessments, is referred to as their graduateness. Students will also judge the experience of teaching and learning in relation to the compatibility of the expressed values of the university with the values that they have come to choose in directing their own lives. The T.B. Davie formulation of academic freedom confers on the university the freedom to choose what shall be taught, who shall teach, just to remind you, who shall be taught, and how they will be taught. In other words, capturing freedoms over student admissions, academic recruitment, curriculum, including research, and pedagogy. If I rely on Isaiah Berlin's conceptualization of two forms of freedoms or liberties, he uses these words interchangeably. This formulation confers positive freedoms on the university. The freedom to make choices and to do certain things. So positive freedoms refer to the choices that we wish to make that will serve the ends that we have chosen to live our lives by. On the other hand, if we think about the place of students in a framework of academic freedom, we have to give greater focus on what Berlin refers to as the negative freedoms. These are the freedoms from something. In other words, the freedoms from harm, from prejudice, from dogma, that allow the positive freedoms of others to be better expressed. I want to live in my home and make sure that something is in place so that my neighbor doesn't take over my house unreasonably. etc. So the negative freedoms refer to the freedoms from unwanted exclusion, etc. The importance of the distinction between positive and negative freedoms is that positive freedoms belong in the domain of the individual. It allows individual agency to choose the path that the person or the institutions deem best to achieve the ends that they have willingly chosen to serve. Negative freedoms, on the other hand, belong in the domain of authorities and communities. We grant custodianship of these freedoms to those in authority. We expect that our freedoms from harm and unjustified exclusion or discrimination will be properly attended to. Of course, it's quite easy to see how negative freedoms can also become the subject of abuse by bad governments or institutional authorities. State actions such as personal surveillance or persecution of people who hold dissenting views are almost always justified by the need to defend the negative freedoms of the community. Some of the negative freedoms are quite obvious, of course, like security on campus, etc., physical harm, and so on. But it's necessary to stretch this argument further and to say that the principles of academic freedom also oblige a university to give expression to the liberating value of education. And, everybody quotes Nelson Mandela about the liberating value of education. By being proactive about ensuring that students have opportunity to develop the knowledge, skills, and habits of mind that will allow them to maintain a skeptical attitude towards the received wisdom, and to critically reflect on prejudice, dogma, and misconception, both of their own making and in that of others, in their living and working lives as graduates. The duty to free students from such forms of unreason lies with the university, and it is in this sense that the idea of the liberating value of education can be seen as a negative freedom in the learning development of students. Together with competent classroom teaching and functioning learning facilities, students should also find a university that is responsive to the liberating value of education by being open to different ways of knowing and universal in its approach to the world of ideas, and that these values can be found in the general operation of the university as well as in the individual academics who will teach the students. In thinking about institutional culture of a university, it is helpful to describe this in 3 layers of experience by the people who will engage with the university. The first layer relates to the experience of a casual visitor, spends a short time at the university, say a parent, say a possible donor or a likely research collaborator from another university. Such a visitor will consciously or unconsciously acknowledge the state of the buildings, the neatness of the gardens, the posters on the walls that make statements about institutional values, or carry invitations to lectures, art events, or protest meetings. They may even get a glimpse of the state of the teaching spaces, student residences, or research facilities. Those who have visited under-resourced or otherwise troubled universities will recognize how important sorry, I've lost my place. We'll recognize how important this first layer view is in forming our judgments about the general operational and academic culture of such an institution. The second level of institutional culture relates to the formal regulation of the relationships between different sectors of the university itself. The academic, human resources, operational rules, the policy statements of the university, and the ways in which these are meant to regulate power and authority relationships across the institution. These rules are also meant to describe the requirements and processes for accountability by staff and students, whether a student will be called out for smoking in the hallway or playing music too loudly in the residence, or how academics are to account for the study performance of the students in their classes. The third layer, which is the more important layer that I want to place particular emphasis on, is the thick and complex network of unwritten rules that direct individuals and committees into making choices, while creating the illusion that those choices were rationally or freely made. These are what writers like Slavoj Žižek refer to as the meta rules that make up the habits of a society or of a community, including things like the rules for what should be taken as polite behavior, or the subjects that we are not to speak about in public or in open discussion, or even, in fact, to think about the rules and the subjects that we are consciously meant to disregard. An example in the English language is if I say, do you mind closing the door? It sounds as though I'm giving you a choice, but actually you don't have a choice. Polite behavior says you should ignore that choice, even though it sounds like I'm giving you a choice. Yeah. And to quote Zizek more directly, every legal order or every order of explicit normativeness has to rely on a complex network of informal rules, which tells us how we are to relate to explicit norms, how we are to apply them, to what extent we are to take them literally, how and when we are allowed, even solicited, to disregard them. And I just gave you an example. Trying to pin down these meta rules is much like the proverbial attempt at nailing one's porridge to the wall. We feel its effects, positive or negative, without being able to point exactly to the thing or the behavior that stimulated that feeling. It is not uncommon at a university, or such as many other institutions, when proposing a new initiative or a different way of doing something, that somebody will say to you, somebody who's been in the institution for longer perhaps, will say, that's not the way we do things here. Aside from the question of how the way we do things here became the way we do things here, it's perhaps more interesting to consider how the unwritten ways in which things are done at a particular university become so deeply infused into the psyche of mid-level academic and administrative staff as to almost automate their choices on matters of practice and strategy. All institutions can speak of the unique ways in which they do things to arrive at the same outcomes as their neighboring institution. And this in itself is not a bad thing. It's good that students graduate with a distinctive flavor, if you will, of a particular characteristic of what it means to be a graduate of a University of Miami, which is distinct from a different university. And that this characteristic will include the habits of mind and the values that the university wished to develop in its graduates. But ensuring that the impact of this characteristic is always positive demands an acute awareness, particularly on the part of institutional leadership, of the complex internal network of informal rules and the need to consciously and continually act to direct and shape its form. Now, of course, this network of unwritten rules for normative behavior will have been constructed over a long time. And it's important that we think about the way in which this is done, because, of course, it points to the way in which we make choices about who will serve on committees, why so few women find themselves represented in upper level positions, etc. Even though, certainly in my country, women graduate in larger numbers than men do. The point is that we actually automate our decisions through social networks and these unwritten rules. Prior socialization is obviously an important contributor, but it doesn't go far enough to explain how institutionally we are able to sustain the general compliance of almost the entire university community. And the reality is that most people in social institutions will quickly learn to bow down before the rules of behavior that count for affirmation and that turns each of us into one of us. And it's here that the jokes become important. Which jokes we tell, how we laugh at which jokes, as part of the rules of affirmation. Universities must be more consciously aware of all the informal contributions to learning. And as with formal classroom learning, must try to ensure that the student experience and interactions are positively directed. A badly cleaned lecture room or an ill-spoken word from a lecturer or an administrator all contribute to bad learning opportunities. And we must be careful about the way in which we think of our students and their learning expectations. And sometimes I find academics are too openly disparaging of what they think they can expect of their students. And what this does is that it develops what I call the institutional pathologies of an institutional culture. I'm using the word pathology in its medical sense to indicate a disease or an abnormality that requires specialist attention, time, and remedial treatment to be healed. These pathologies are the attitudes and behavior that operate at the level of the meta rules and act to marginalize, exclude, or hurt particular groups of the university community. If left unchecked, such pathologies act to corrupt the primary purpose of the university, which is to bring meaning to complexity in the process of developing the next generation of graduates and intellectuals who will go out to engage with critical questions of the human condition in more positive and more development ways than their teachers did. Universities are duty-bound to ensure that the students do and achieve better than the previous generation did. I do want to make the point that the fact that our staff and students arrive with prior socialization that include the pathologies of behavior patterns that we are concerned about is not a reason for their continued existence in our institutional cultures. Universities must resist the paralyzing argument that it is a microcosm of its society and should therefore expect bad social behavior from its staff and students. Universities serve better if they aim to be a microcosm of what society could be like in all their operations and human interactions. I want to illustrate this point in what I think is one of the most pernicious forms of social pathology, and that is gender-based violence. I think it is factually correct to say that most men will not rape a woman. However, this is not a useful starting point for understanding the place and meaning of gender-based violence in society as institutional pathology. The reason is that each time a man goes out to rape or purposely hurt a woman, all men are beneficiaries. What the rapist does is he reinforces the patterns of masculinity and patriarchy that are part of the meta rules of society. And of course, I'm talking about rape, particularly about men visiting hurt on women. There are other forms of it, of course, and I accept that. The rapist is part of the mechanism that ensures that the patterns of patriarchy are continuously reproduced. We make similar arguments for racism. While not all white or German people did terrible things to black or Jewish people in apartheid South Africa or in Germany before the Second World War, all white South Africans and all Germans were beneficiaries of those acts. And therefore, while it is not possible to make an argument for collective guilt, it is possible to make an argument for collective responsibility on these social harms. And I think that what is important is that we must all actively work at institutional cultures that respond to the sense of our collective responsibility in ways to correct the behavior and ensure that our institutional cultures do not perpetuate these kind of habits of thinking. The duty to defend the negative freedoms of students rests with the university, and directing the culture and lived values of the university and the ways that students will experience this as a part of their learning is one of the essential tasks of university leadership. We accept that, as was the case in apartheid South Africa, the act of structurally excluding or unreasonably limiting the enrollment of particular groups of students is offensive to the principles of academic freedom at a university. Whatever its cause, such group exclusion limits the diversity of opinion and ideas at the university and forces it to deteriorate into a monocultural institution, which must, by this fact alone, undereducate its students. Students graduate from such institutions with their prejudices intact because they've not had an opportunity to see the world through the eyes of the other, with important negative implications for their graduateness. A university learning experience impacts on the constructed identity of its students, and it is important that the university is aware of the need to affirm rather than undermine their students' conceptions of themselves. No one should feel a need to apologize for their identity at a university, because it is precisely in the human diversity that the critical world of ideas will thrive. Institutional values and what the institutional culture do and are meant to find expression in the structure of the curriculum and the way in which we teach our students. In its formal sense, Teaching is the front end of our task of engaging with the process of education as a liberating experience for the next generation of intellectuals. The relationship between those who teach and those who learn cannot be described in purely pecuniary or resource terms. It is here that teachers are to make good on the promise that a university makes to its public, that students will be provided with a good quality, proper education, and that to the best of its institutional ability, the university will try to ensure that students leave as positively engaged graduates. In reflecting on the form and process of teaching and learning at the university that has chosen to actively express the principles of academic freedom, it is important to keep in mind Max Weber's caveat about the limits of a university education. A university education is not meant to answer the big questions to which all human beings have to respond. Who am I? How should I live? What choices should I make? These are questions that our students must answer for themselves. And at the broader level, our task is to give them the context to provide answers to such questions, and to develop in them the reasoning ability that will arrive at defensible answers in a world that is complex and frighteningly ambiguous. Our role as academics is to educate, not to captivate. Our students are not to be made captive to particular worldviews, particular social or political views, or particular forms of knowledge about the empirically observable world. Teaching in the context of the liberating value of education requires that we develop in our students the habits of mind and reasoning characteristics of intellectuals, a sense of the value of knowledge for its own sake, a capacity for critical reasoning outside of one's discipline, an ability to keep two diametrically opposing ideas in one's mind and still be fully functional, celebrating rather than merely tolerating diversity of opinion as a core value, recognizing respectful criticism as the finest gift that one can give or receive. And at the end of a hard day of argument, of analysis, or in defense of strongly held view, being willing to quietly say, I may have been wrong today. That's an important point. I have noted before that the monocultural university, or one that valorizes a particular cultural view or way of knowing above all others, cannot help but undereducate its students. On the other hand, students who enroll at a university that commits to the principles of academic freedom should reasonably expect that the lecturers will be open to the possibility of other ways of knowing. And there are types of problems that are insoluble unless one is willing to be led by the hand to stand in an unfamiliar or sometimes uncomfortable place from which to view the problem. This is not an unusual approach in many knowledge disciplines, and the area of complex number theory makes a useful illustration. For those of you who remember your undergraduate mathematics, this is a branch of mathematics that relies on the seemingly ridiculous argument that the equation x squared plus 1 equals naught has a solution. It requires that you accept that the square root of minus 1 exists, which, to all that we know about numbers, is ridiculous. Yet there's a wide range of problems in disciplines from electrical supply to quantum mechanics that cannot be solved unless we accept complex number analysis as another way of knowing numbers. Similarly, the teacher who acknowledges only a European worldview and speaks only English, say, will lack both the words and the conceptual understanding of family or community connectedness in much of Asia, Africa, or South America. Such a teacher will find it strange that these are peoples who have more than one word for uncle or for grandmother. In an anthropology, politics, or public health class, faced with African, Chinese, or Indian students, such a teacher would be educationally disadvantaged in the class and may have to attend a bridging course to improve their capacity to teach. There are some aspects of the university and its teaching staff that makes them underprepared for the learning needs of students who attend their classes. Paulo Freire, who was one of the great thinkers, South American thinkers on education theory, emphasizes this point in his consideration of the importance of dialogue in teaching and learning, and the importance of both students and teachers being open to the possibility of other ways of knowing the world. He cautions that, and I'm quoting, dialogue cannot exist without humility. The naming of the world through which we constantly recreate that world cannot be an act of arrogance. The educational development of students is best served when those who teach them are sensitive to the complexities and ways of reasoning in disciplines outside of their own. Of course, we don't expect lecturers to be specialists in all disciplines, but at least they should be open to the possibility that there's another way of knowing this problem. Sorry, I should make this point, I guess. Too often do I meet academics who believe that the only subject worthy of intelligent intellectual discussion is their own research area, and that all other knowledge areas are obvious to the average mind. This is unbecoming of anyone who wishes to claim the title academic or intellectual, and a sectarian approach to disciplinary knowledge can only be harmful to our students. While students in the pure and applied sciences certainly need greater engagement with issues and argument in the humanities and liberal arts, there's an equally concerning threat to society in the poverty of scientific understanding of our humanities graduates and the ease with which they hand their futures over to technocrats on important matters of the relationship between technology and society. If knowledge is truly to be about challenging power, then developing a foundational understanding and respectful approach to ways of knowing in other disciplines is essential for our graduates. And these are the habits of mind that our students should find in those who teach them. To close then, in times when the big questions facing local and global communities change, universities must respond through review and reconsideration of the focus of their educational objectives and of the values that they think are important in student graduateness. The big global questions of environmental sustainability, increasing human misery, levels of social inequality must bear on the intellectual development of our university students. This requires that universities and those who teach should develop an openness to other ways of knowing, not only as a way of defending students against dogma and identity-based exclusion, but also as a means to develop in students the habits of mind that considers such openness to other ways of knowing as intellectually valuable. It also particularly demands of university leaders that they understand and direct the institutional culture of the university in a manner that expresses and reinforces the institutional values in all engagements with staff and students. And it is here that a university can make its most significant contribution to its public through the educational development of graduates who will stretch the front ends of human endeavor with warm hearts and fine minds, and who are awake to the big questions of human suffering and the relationships between power and powerlessness. I thank you. Prannoy, I'm open to comments or questions.